Near Reagan National Airport, a helicopter route ran beside the approach to runway 33. On the chart, the helicopter's maximum altitude was 200 feet. An airplane following the runway's normal 3-degree glide path could cross the same shoreline only about 75 feet above it. That was not guaranteed separation. It was a notional gap inside a corridor with no defined lateral boundary. Controllers had warned about this geometry after a near collision in 2013. Data later recorded thousands of close proximity encounters around the routes, but Route 4 stayed where it was. On January 29, 2025, PSA Flight 5342 descended toward runway 33 while an Army Black Hawk followed Route 4 south. They collided 278 feet above the Potomac. Everyone aboard both aircraft, 67 people, died. The final investigation doesn't describe one bad decision. It describes a collision path embedded in the airspace, surrounded by defenses that looked adequate until every one of them was needed at once. Flight 5342 was a CRJ-700 arriving from Wichita. It was approaching runway 1 when the tower asked whether the crew could accept runway 33. The pilots checked their landing performance, accepted the shorter runway, and began a circling approach to line up with it. At the same time, Priority Air Transport Flight 25, PAT 25, was returning toward Fort Belvoir. The Black Hawk crew was conducting an annual evaluation flight using night vision goggles. The tower had cleared the helicopter through Washington's airspace on routes 1 and 4, a low-altitude path that followed the Potomac. These weren't two aircraft wandering into uncontrolled airspace. Both were talking to the tower. Both were operating on recognized paths, and each crew expected the system around those paths to keep the traffic manageable. To understand why that expectation failed, we need to look at what Route 4 actually promised and what it didn't. Washington's helicopter chart described Route 4 as following the east bank of the Potomac. Near the runway 33 approach, its published altitude was 200 feet, mean sea level or below. But the chart didn't say exactly how far from the shoreline a helicopter had to fly. It gave the route no lateral boundary. And the approach charts used by fixed-wing pilots didn't show the helicopter route crossing nearby. That matters because altitude alone couldn't create a durable barrier. The NTSB reconstructed the geometry in a cross-section. Put a helicopter at 200 feet over the eastern shoreline. Put an airplane on the 3-degree visual glide path to runway 33. The vertical difference is about 75 feet. Move either flight path slightly, add ordinary instrument error, or fly above the route altitude, and that paper-thin margin shrinks. The NTSB labeled the calculation notional because the route didn't define one precise lane in the sky. Army pilots interviewed after the collision generally believed something stronger. If they stayed at or below 200 feet, they thought the route itself would keep them clear of airplanes landing on runway 33. One pilot's explanation was simple. That was why the route was published, but it wasn't a separated corridor. It was a shared operating area whose safety depended heavily on pilots seeing one another and controllers arranging the sequence in real time. The final report says that repeated use of pilot-applied visual separation gradually became normalized as the primary way to manage mixed helicopter and airplane traffic. In daylight, with low workload and an obvious target, traffic in sight can sound like a solid defense. At night, over a city, with multiple aircraft lights and little apparent motion between converging targets, it becomes much less reliable. The danger wasn't invisible. After a military helicopter and a regional jet nearly collided in the same area in 2013, a working group of DCA tower controllers formally proposed moving Route 4 east over Interstate 295 and away from the runway 33 approach. The NTSB found no evidence of a formal response. Controllers raised the route again in later years. They also proposed marking aerial conflict hotspots on the helicopter chart. Those changes weren't adopted. The route was supposed to be reviewed annually. After the 2025 collision, the FAA couldn't provide documentation of those required annual reviews for the Baltimore-Washington helicopter chart. Meanwhile, the traffic left a measurable pattern. FAA data from January 2018 through February 2025 identified 4,067 encounters at 1,000 feet or less between helicopters on routes 1 or 4 and airplanes arriving at or departing from DCA. 348 were at 500 feet or less, an average of 5.6 every month. These figures do not mean 348 near collisions. They don't include all the operating context, and some aircraft were separated visually. But they do show that close geometry was routine, not hypothetical. Altitude data carried another warning. Across 13 months, almost 4 out of 5 recorded track points from 13,866 helicopter flights on routes 1 and 4 were above the published route altitudes. On the northern part of Route 4, the segment containing the collision area, 49% of 523 flights had at least one recorded point above the limit. The FAA had route data. The Army had flight operations. Controllers had local experience. But the final report found no effective system joining that information into a recurring measure of midair risk. That is how a warning can exist everywhere and still belong to no one. On the night of the collision, Flight 5342's move from runway 1 to runway 33 placed it on the approach that crossed Route 4. Pat 25 was already following the river south. The same controller was working both local traffic and helicopter traffic. The NTSB found that combining those positions during elevated traffic increased workload, degraded situational awareness, and contributed to incomplete advisories and missing safety alerts. There was no structured real-time risk process, forcing the tower team to pause and reassess the operation as the conflict developed. About 20 seconds before impact, the controller asked Pat 25 whether it had the airplane in sight and instructed the helicopter to pass behind it. But while the controller was speaking, one of the helicopter pilots keyed the radio for 0.8 of a second. The simultaneous transmission blocked the words "pass behind" from reaching the helicopter. Pat 25's instructor pilot again said the traffic was in sight and requested visual separation. The tower approved it. But degraded radio reception had kept the crew from hearing that Flight 5342 was circling to a different runway, and the NTSB found that the helicopter crew hadn't positively identified the CRJ. The visual scene offered little help. It was night. City lights filled the background. Other aircraft were approaching runway 1, and because the CRJ and helicopter were converging, their relative bearing changed very little. A target on a collision course can appear almost stationary in the windshield until it suddenly grows. Pat 25 was also flying above Route 4's 200-foot maximum. The investigation found that the Army hadn't ensured its pilots understood how allowable error in a helicopter's barometric altimeter could affect the indicated altitude. That was causal, but it wasn't the whole mechanism. Even the chart's notional 75-foot gap was too small to function as independent separation. Now the system was relying on its final technological defenses. The Black Hawk had no integrated collision avoidance system. Tablets aboard it could display ADSB traffic and could have warned about the CRJ 48 seconds before impact. But Army pilots typically didn't monitor those tablets while flying low-level routes, and the pilot's helmet audio couldn't receive the alert. In the cockpit's ambient noise, it wasn't an effective warning channel. Flight 5342 did have TCAS. It operated as designed. But at that altitude, the system's alert rules inhibited the resolution advisory that would have commanded an avoidance maneuver. The crew received a basic traffic alert, not an instruction telling them how to escape. They detected the helicopter only about 1 second before impact. Pat 25 continued south on Route 4. Flight 5342 continued down the runway 33 approach. At about 278 feet, mean sea level, the two paths became 1 point. The collision destroyed both aircraft and killed all 64 people on the airliner and all 3 soldiers aboard the helicopter. For the people on board and the families waiting for them, every layer of this analysis leads to the same irreversible result. The purpose of tracing the system isn't to turn loss into abstraction. It is to identify which defenses existed only on paper, which warnings went unowned, and which changes can prevent another crew from reaching the same point. The NTSB's probable cause finding begins with the airspace itself. The FAA placed a helicopter route close to a runway approach, did not regularly review the route and available data, did not act on recommendations to reduce the risk, and relied too heavily on visual separation to keep traffic moving. The board also identified ineffective visual separation by the helicopter crew, the tower team's loss of situational awareness under high workload, the absence of a real-time risk assessment process, and the Army's failure to train pilots on altimeter error tolerances. Limitations in the warning systems on both aircraft, traffic pressure at DCA, gaps in safety management, and fragmented data sharing also contributed. The technology was not beyond improvement. In NTSB simulations, the newer TCAS XA system could have warned Flight 5342 about the helicopter roughly 8 seconds earlier. When investigators lowered the altitude at which an avoidance command was inhibited, the modeled collision risk fell by more than 90%. That doesn't prove one warning would certainly have saved the flight. It shows that the last defense could be designed to remain active where this collision occurred. 5 weeks after the crash, the NTSB urgently recommended closing the Route 4 segment between Haynes Point and the Wilson Bridge whenever runway 33 was used for arrivals, or runway 15 for departures, and creating an alternative helicopter route. The FAA removed that segment from the helicopter chart on March 14, 2025. It also restricted use of several DCA runways during specified helicopter operations nearby. The route change controllers had sought for years happened only after the collision. The final report went further, issuing 33 recommendations to the FAA and 8 to the Army, plus others aimed at federal policy, oversight, and collision avoidance standards. They cover route design, recurring chart reviews, controller workload, shared frequencies, block transmission alerts, ADSB, new collision avoidance systems, Army flight data monitoring, and a public database of close proximity encounters. It is tempting to find one moment and stop there. The runway change, the block transmission, the words "traffic in sight," the helicopter's altitude, or the alert that came too late. Each mattered. None explains why the system allowed 2 approved paths to converge with so little margin. Route 4 had no precise lateral boundary. Its altitude did not guarantee separation. Controllers had proposed moving it after a near collision. Years of traffic data showed repeated close encounters. Yet the route, the approach, the workload, the radio procedures, and the warning systems remained separate pieces of safety information. No single process assembled them into the obvious picture. That is the failure logic. Catastrophe did not begin when 2 aircraft became visible to each other over the Potomac. It began when a known crossing was treated as manageable again and again, until one night the remaining margins disappeared.